I wasn't supposed to hear that sentence. I was lying in a hospital bed in Portland, still heavy from anesthesia, pretending to sleep because it was easier than asking my husband why he had only stayed 12 minutes that afternoon. The hallway outside my room carried sound too clearly. Jonathan's voice was low, urgent, almost excited in a way I hadn't heard in months. "We just have to get through this," he said. "The money's already moved. Over there. It's safe." A woman answered him. Calm. Certain. "The account confirmed the last transfer this morning. Once you file, there won't be anything left here." My heart slammed so hard I felt it in my ears. I didn't need to open my eyes to know it was Stephanie, the physical therapist he had once introduced as a gym acquaintance. I didn't need to ask what over there meant. They weren't just having an affair. They were moving our money out of the country before the divorce. And they thought I was asleep. I kept my breathing slow, steady, the way the nurse had shown me earlier when the pain flared. My body was stitched and swollen from surgery, hormones raging, but my mind had never felt sharper. Every word outside that door pressed itself into my memory like ink on wet paper. Jonathan stepped back into the room a minute later. I felt the mattress shift as he leaned over me. "She's still out," he whispered, almost relieved. His hand brushed mine. I didn't move. I had never been good at pretending. But that day, I learned. 3 days later, I was discharged and back in our townhouse in Southwest Portland. Recovery instructions lined the kitchen counter, medications, follow-up appointments, dietary restrictions. Jonathan moved through the house like a guest. Polite, efficient, distant. He checked on me, but not really. "How's the pain?" he'd ask, already halfway to his phone. When I answered, he nodded without listening. Stephanie's name never came up, but her shadow did. 2 nights after I came home, his mother stopped by with soup I didn't ask for. She stood in our kitchen, surveying the space as if she were evaluating it for resale. "You need to focus on healing," she told me gently. "Let Jonathan handle the complicated financial matters. Investments can be stressful." "Investments?" I smiled. "What investments?" "Oh, you know, international diversification. Smart planning for the future." Her tone carried that soft condescension I'd grown used to over the years. As if designing complex user systems for a tech firm meant I only understood colors and buttons. As if I didn't spend my days mapping logic flows and security vulnerabilities. Jonathan's older brother, Mark, arrived later that evening. He clapped Jonathan on the shoulder and said, "Timing is everything. If you move quickly, opportunities don't slip away." They thought I wasn't listening. I was always listening. Back in my office, I opened my laptop, not the shared desktop in the living room, but my own encrypted machine. I checked project updates from work first, almost out of habit. Designing digital interfaces required a certain discipline. Observe patterns, identify friction, anticipate risk. That discipline slid naturally into my own life. Jonathan had changed 8 weeks ago. That was when the late nights began. When he started flipping his phone face down. When he insisted on handling the bank notifications because they were cluttering my inbox. 8 weeks ago. The same week Stephanie had posted a photo with a hand resting protectively over a barely visible curve beneath her shirt. I remembered confronting him then. Lightly. Casually. "You seem distracted." He laughed. "You're overthinking. You always do that." Maybe I did. But overthinking had built my career. 3 days after I came home from the hospital, I was sorting through post-surgery emails, insurance confirmations, pharmacy alerts, calendar reminders when one subject line caught my eye. International wire confirmation, secondary account. I almost deleted it. We received enough spam pretending to be banks. But the sender address was real. Our joint bank. And the preview text showed something that made my chest tighten. Beneficiary institution. Valletta. Valletta. I clicked. The email wasn't promotional. It was formal. Clinical. A confirmation of a completed international wire transfer. It listed the beneficiary bank in Malta. A SWIFT code. a transaction reference number, and a note indicating recurring instruction active. Recurring. My pulse slowed instead of racing. That was always my tell? When something mattered, I went quiet. The email had been sent to both the primary and secondary contact addresses on file. Jonathan was primary. I was secondary, which meant someone had adjusted the notification settings recently. I logged into the bank portal. The dashboard loaded slowly, as if it too understood the weight of what it was about to reveal. There it was. A transfer from our joint account to a Maltese institution. Not once. Not twice. 5 separate transactions over 5 weeks. Each one just under an internal reporting threshold I recognized from user research I'd once done on financial compliance systems. Structured. Intentional. Under the wire. But not invisible. I scrolled further. The first transfer date. 8 weeks ago. The same week I'd scheduled my surgery. The same week Stephanie's hand appeared in that photo. My screen reflected my face back at me, pale. Eyes steady. Mouth set. I didn't cry. I didn't call Jonathan. I didn't confront him in the kitchen or demand explanations about Malta or divorce or pregnancy. Instead, I clicked into the account notification settings. Primary contact. Jonathan Hale. Secondary contact. Megan Hale. Alert configuration modified. 8 weeks ago. Modified by primary account holder. My husband had removed me from automatic alerts. But whoever processed the international wire confirmation had accidentally included secondary contact in the final copy. A small mistake. The kind that happens when someone is confident the system won't be questioned. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the list of transactions. At the beneficiary line. At the word recurring. In the hallway of a hospital. I had heard him say, "Once you file, there won't be anything left here." Now I knew what he meant. As I refreshed the portal one more time, a new line appeared at the top of the transaction list. Pending. Scheduled for tomorrow morning. The amount was nearly triple the others. I closed my laptop slowly. If that transfer cleared, whatever was left of our marriage wouldn't be the only thing gone. I opened the email again and read every line as if it were code I had written myself. The formatting was clean. The language was sterile. International wire confirmation. Beneficiary institution. Bank of Valletta. Swift code. Reference number. Amount. Date processed. And at the bottom, almost casually, recurring instruction active. Recurring? That single phrase carried more weight than the amount itself. I logged into our joint account dashboard, entering my credentials slowly, aware of how ordinary the act looked from the outside. The interface loaded, blue and white, reassuring in its simplicity. Balances, savings, scheduled payments. Then I clicked into transaction history. The first Malta transfer had occurred 8 weeks ago. The second one the following Friday. Then another. And another. 5 in total. Each spaced exactly 7 days apart. Each one just below a threshold that I recognized from a user research project I had once worked on. Amounts that would not automatically trigger enhanced compliance review. He hadn't been careless. He had been systematic. I clicked into details on the second transfer. Originating account. Our joint savings. Authorization method. Online approval. Device recognized. I navigated to account alerts and settings. International transfer notifications had been set to primary account holder only. That change had been made 8 weeks ago. Modified by Jonathan Hale. My jaw tightened. But my hand stayed steady. What he hadn't anticipated was the back-end confirmation protocol. When certain international wires were processed, a compliance copy was generated and sent to all associated contacts. That was the email I had received. A small oversight in a system he thought he understood completely. I pulled up the timeline in my head. 8 weeks ago, I had been sitting in a pre-op consultation room, listening to a surgeon explain recovery windows and hormonal fluctuations. 8 weeks ago, Stephanie had posted that carefully cropped photo, her hand resting on her abdomen. 8 weeks ago, Jonathan had insisted on streamlining our financial alerts because I needed less stress. It wasn't coincidence. It was choreography. I scrolled further down the transaction list and noticed something else. The amounts weren't identical, but they followed a pattern, large enough to drain, small enough to avoid internal friction, structured movement, intentional fragmentation. This wasn't a spontaneous act of betrayal. It was an exit strategy. I opened a new tab and searched the beneficiary institution. Bank of Valletta. Private investment vehicles. International client services. Residency by investment programs. Residency. My stomach dropped. I returned to the wire details and scanned the reference field more closely. The first few transfers had standard numeric references, but the most recent one included an additional line of text I hadn't noticed before. Project Atlas Holdings. That wasn't our name. It wasn't Jonathan's personal account. It wasn't mine. I copied the phrase and searched state business registries. Atlas Holdings LLC. Registered in Delaware. Formation date. 6 weeks ago. Authorized manager. Mark Hale. Jonathan's older brother. My pulse didn't spike this time. It settled into something colder. The mailing address listed for the LLC wasn't our home. It wasn't Jonathan's office. It was his mother's condo in Scottsdale, Arizona. I stared at the screen and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just an affair supported by reckless spending. This was coordinated, family-backed, structured to move quietly before a filing that hadn't yet occurred. I clicked back into our bank portal and navigated to linked accounts. There was a secondary savings account I rarely used, mostly because we had agreed years ago to consolidate our savings. It had a modest balance, at least. It had before. 2 of the Malta transfers had originated there. That account required dual authorization for transactions above a certain threshold. But the transfers had been split deliberately, each one just under the limit that would have required my explicit confirmation. He hadn't needed my approval. He had simply designed around it. I opened the authentication logs. Most users never looked at them. They were tucked away under security settings, a place only someone paranoid or trained would think to check. Several of the wire authorizations were tagged as originating from a recognized device. My laptop. My stomach tightened. I checked timestamps. One of the authorizations had been completed at 9:23 in the morning. I had been in surgical prep at 9:23 that morning. My phone had been locked in a hospital locker. My laptop had been at home, which meant Jonathan had logged in under my credentials. He knew my passwords. Of course he did. We were married. Shared streaming accounts. Shared utilities. Shared life. Shared trust. Or what I had thought was trust. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. But not in grief. In recalibration. This wasn't just hidden money. This was concealment. Identity usage. Structured avoidance. A timeline that aligned too perfectly with a pregnancy and whispered hallway promises. My phone buzzed on the desk. Jonathan. Running late. Server issue. I stared at the message. Server issue? I typed back. Okay. Take your time. Then I refreshed the transaction page again. At the top of the list, highlighted in faint gray, was a pending wire scheduled for processing at 9 a.m. the next morning. The amount was nearly 3 times the others. Originating account. Secondary savings. Destination. Bank of Valletta. Reference. Atlas Holdings LLC. I clicked into the details and saw something else. Something small. Almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Authorization method. Online approval, user verified. The status read, awaiting final processing. He was accelerating. Whatever they had planned, whatever filing he intended to initiate, this transfer was meant to complete it. I looked around my quiet home office. The framed wedding photo on the shelf. The plant in the corner that I had nearly killed and revived twice. The stack of recovery paperwork on my desk. They thought I wouldn't check. They thought I was too distracted by pain, by hormones, by recovery to notice patterns. They forgot what I did for a living. I created systems, and systems always leave traces. I opened a secure folder on my laptop and downloaded every transaction record, every authentication log, every notification setting change. I saved screenshots. I documented timestamps. I created a spreadsheet mapping transfers against key dates. 8 weeks ago. Surgery scheduled. 7 weeks ago. First Malta wire. 6 weeks ago. Atlas Holdings LLC registered. 5 weeks ago. Stephanie's soon caption. Today, pending triple transfer. I closed the laptop gently. If that wire cleared in the morning, recovering the funds would become exponentially harder. But if I acted too soon, I might tip him off. And right now, the only advantage I had was that he believed I was still asleep. I pulled the prenuptial agreement from a folder I hadn't opened in years. It was stored in my encrypted cloud vault. Scanned the week before our wedding. Labeled simply, legal, marriage. I almost smiled at how ordinary that label felt now. Marriage. As if it had ever been just one word. Jonathan had laughed the day we signed it. This is just formalities, he'd said, nudging my shoulder as if I were being overly cautious. We're not planning for failure. I hadn't been planning for failure. I had been planning for unpredictability. I opened the document and scrolled slowly, rereading language I had once studied carefully and then, in the comfort of newlywed optimism, tucked away, separate property definitions, asset classifications, debt responsibilities. Then I found the clause I was looking for. Constructive concealment of marital assets. The wording was precise. Any attempt to transfer, reclassify, or relocate joint marital assets outside the United States within 6 months prior to filing for dissolution of marriage, without documented written consent from both parties, would trigger automatic protective reclassification of certain individually titled assets. I read it twice, then a third time. He hadn't filed yet, but he had moved money, repeatedly, internationally, within that 6-month window, and he did not have my written consent. The clause didn't operate on emotion. It operated on evidence and timing. Timing. I opened my spreadsheet again and aligned the dates with the language in the prenup. First transfer. 7 weeks ago. 6-month window. Active. No written consent. Confirmed. But the clause required more than movement. It required proof of intent to conceal in anticipation of dissolution. Intent. That would be the battlefield. I closed the legal document and searched for attorneys specializing in complex asset division in Oregon. Not general divorce attorneys. Not family mediation specialists. Asset tracing. Financial fraud and marital dissolution. Cross-border transfers. One name appeared repeatedly in legal journals and high-conflict case summaries. I drafted a secure email and attached selected documentation. Transaction history, screenshots of alert modifications, the pending wire scheduled for the next morning. Within 2 hours, my phone rang. "This is Daniel Mercer," the voice said. Calm, analytical. "You mentioned recurring offshore wires." "Yes." "Has a petition for divorce been filed?" "Not yet." There was a brief pause. "Then you may have leverage." I explained the timeline. The hospital hallway. The pregnancy. The structured transfers. The LLC in Delaware under his brother's name. Daniel didn't interrupt. When I finished, he asked one question. "Did he access your credentials to authorize any of these transfers?" "I believe so." Another pause. Longer this time. "That changes the exposure." We discussed the prenup clause in detail. He asked me to read specific passages aloud. Confirming language around cross-border relocation and constructive concealment, he explained that if we could demonstrate pre-filing intent to shield assets, the protective trigger could be invoked. "But intent is everything," he said. "We need a pattern that shows planning for dissolution, not just investment." Investment. I almost laughed. I pulled up the Delaware Business Registry while we were still on the call. "Atlas Holdings, LLC," I said. "Registered 6 weeks ago. Authorized manager. His brother. Mailing address. His mother's condo." "And the first wire?" Daniel asked. 7 weeks ago. Formation date. 6 weeks ago. So the structure appeared after the initial transfer, he said. That suggests evolution of strategy. Strategy. It sounded clinical when he said it. Less like betrayal. More like a case study. What about the pending wire? He asked. Scheduled for 9 tomorrow. Triple the prior amounts. If that clears, he said carefully, recovery becomes more complicated. Not impossible, but more complicated. I stared at the screen. At the gray pending status line, what would you recommend? I asked. I recommend we prepare an emergency motion for temporary financial restraining order. But timing matters. If we file too early, he'll know you're aware. If we wait too long, the funds may move beyond immediate jurisdiction. Jurisdiction. Another system boundary. Do you believe he's about to file? Daniel asked. I thought of the hallway. The word once you file? Yes. Then we're operating inside the window. After the call ended, I sat still in my office. The house was quiet. Jonathan had texted earlier about a server issue. I didn't respond. Instead, I dug deeper. I searched the Delaware LLC documents more thoroughly. The registered agent was a third-party compliance service, but the initial filing fee had been paid from an account ending in the last 4 digits of our joint savings. Sloppy, or confident. I opened the secondary savings account details and confirmed that 2 of the prior Malta transfers had originated there. That account required dual authorization for large transactions. But the amounts had been split deliberately, each just below the dual confirmation threshold. He hadn't overridden safeguards. He had designed around them. I checked authentication logs again. One of the earlier authorizations had occurred at 9:23 the morning of my surgery. I remembered being wheeled toward an operating room at 9:15. My phone had been locked in a hospital locker. My laptop had been at home, which meant Jonathan had logged in under my name. I forwarded that log to Daniel. Within minutes, he replied. If we can substantiate credential misuse, this escalates significantly. Do not confront him yet. I had no intention of confronting him. Confrontation was emotional. Documentation was structural. I returned to the prenup and highlighted the concealment clause. Then I opened a fresh document and began constructing a timeline. Surgery scheduled. Stephanie's pregnancy announcement. Alert settings modified. First international wire. LLC formation. Recurring transfers. Pending triple wire. The pattern wasn't subtle. It was layered. I heard the front door open downstairs. Jonathan's footsteps moved through the kitchen. A cabinet door shut. The refrigerator opened. Ordinary sounds. I minimized my screens and closed the legal document, leaving only a design mock-up open on my laptop. He stepped into the doorway of my office. How are you feeling? He asked, leaning casually against the frame. Better, I said. He smiled. Too quickly. Good. I'm glad. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then back at me. I have to take this, he said. He stepped into the hallway. I didn't mean to listen, but I did. The last batch goes tomorrow, he whispered. After that, it's clean. Clean. I refreshed the bank portal one more time. The pending wire was still there. Processing at 9 if it cleared. Their exit would accelerate. If I moved now, the game would change. I closed my laptop slowly. They believed the system was under their control. They didn't realize I had just mapped it. Jonathan's mother insisted on Sunday dinner as if nothing in the world had shifted. Her house in Lake Oswego smelled like rosemary chicken and polished wood, the same as it always had. The dining table was set for 4. Mark arrived 10 minutes after we did, carrying a bottle of wine and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. How are you healing? Megan, his mother asked as she adjusted the silverware. You need to focus on rest. Stress isn't good for recovery. I'm doing fine, I said. Jonathan squeezed my shoulder lightly, the gesture almost performative. She's been overworking already. I keep telling her to slow down. Overworking. As if staring at authentication logs counted as a hobby. Dinner began with small talk, work. Weather, a neighbor's kitchen renovation. But underneath it ran a different current. I could feel it in the pauses. In the way sentences ended slightly too carefully. Mark leaned back in his chair and said, almost casually, "Timing is everything with investments. If you move too late, you lose the advantage." Jonathan gave him a warning look. Subtle but sharp. His mother waved a hand dismissively. International markets are complicated. Most people don't understand how fluid capital has to be. Most people? I took a sip of water. Fluid to where it grows, she replied smoothly. Sometimes that means outside the United States. Jonathan laughed lightly. Mom's been watching too many financial podcasts. But his eyes flicked toward Mark again. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I watched, after dinner, while Jonathan helped clear plates. I slipped into the hallway and opened my phone. I pulled up the Delaware registry again. Atlas Holdings LLC, authorized manager. Mark Hale, registered mailing address. The Scottsdale condo owned by Jonathan's mother. The formation date aligned almost perfectly with the first Malta transfer. The second transfer had cleared 2 days after the LLC was registered. I stepped back into the dining room just as Mark said, "You just have to be proactive before paperwork complicates things." Paperwork. Jonathan's mother noticed me standing there and smiled. "We were just talking about the future. Planning is important." "I agree," I said. On the drive home, Jonathan was unusually quiet. "You okay?" he asked finally. "I'm fine," I said. "Your family seems very interested in international finance lately." He shrugged. "They're just exploring opportunities. With your brother as manager of a new LLC." His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "What LLC?" I looked at him calmly. "Atlas Holdings." A beat passed. Too long. "That's just something Mark is experimenting with," he said. "It's not a big deal. Does it connect to Malta?" He didn't answer immediately. "You're overthinking again," he said finally. "It's just diversification." Diversification. The word sounded rehearsed. Back home, Jonathan retreated into his office under the pretense of checking work emails. I opened my laptop and pulled up the transaction details again. The routing numbers for 2 of the Malta transfers included intermediary banking codes that matched the Delaware LLC's formation documents. Atlas wasn't the final destination. It was a funnel. I ran a quick search through public filings and discovered something else. A private trust had been registered 3 weeks ago under a corporate trustee based in Nevada. The trust name was deliberately generic. But the initials of the listed secondary beneficiary matched Stephanie's middle name. My chest tightened, but my face remained still. This wasn't temporary movement of funds. This was infrastructure. My phone buzzed. Stephanie had posted a new photo. A sunset, filtered warm and gold. The caption read, "Soon." Comments were disabled. One visible reply from a private account caught my attention. "Malta will be beautiful this time of year." My stomach turned cold. I forwarded screenshots to Daniel. "Within minutes," he responded. "If family members knowingly participated, exposure broadens. Exposure broadens." The phrase echoed in my mind. Jonathan emerged from his office around 9. Softer than usual. "How's your pain?" he asked, stepping behind me and resting his hands lightly on my shoulders. "It's manageable. You shouldn't be stressing about money," he said gently. "I've got everything under control." Under control. I looked up at him. "Do you?" He smiled, but it faltered at the edges. "I'm handling the complicated stuff," he said. "You don't need to worry." I nodded slowly. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I returned to the bank portal. The pending wire was still marked processing. Estimated clearance. 9 hours. I checked the secondary savings account again. Its balance was already lower than it had been 2 months ago. 2 structured transfers had drained it quietly. He had chosen that account because I rarely checked it. He had chosen the weeks of my surgery and recovery because he assumed my focus would be elsewhere. He had chosen his brother as manager because family loyalty is harder to penetrate. He had chosen Malta because distance creates delay. He believed I would react emotionally. He didn't understand that I react structurally. At 11:42 p.m., Jonathan's phone lit up on his nightstand. He rolled over and answered quietly. "Yeah," he whispered. "It'll clear tomorrow morning." A pause. "No?" "She doesn't know." Silence. "Once that batch moves, it's clean." Clean? I stared at the ceiling in the dark. If that transfer cleared at 9 a.m., the majority of our joint liquidity would be outside immediate jurisdiction. Recovery would require cross-border proceedings. Daniel had warned me about timing. Act too early, and he would adapt. Wait too long, and the system would close. I reached for my phone and opened Daniel's last message. "If he escalates transfers, we move fast." I looked at the clock. 6 hours until banking systems began their processing cycle. The house was quiet. The future they were building felt almost tangible in the silence. But silence is only dangerous when it hides truth. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes. Not to sleep, but to think. If they believed tomorrow would secure their escape, then tomorrow would have to change everything. I didn't sleep. At 6:30 in the morning, I was already sitting at my desk. The bank portal open. The pending wire highlighted in gray. Processing. Estimated settlement. 9 a.m. The amount was nearly 3 times the prior transfers. If it cleared, it would drain most of what remained in our accessible joint liquidity. My hands were steady. My pulse was not. I dialed Daniel at 6:45. He answered on the second ring. "Tell me it hasn't settled." "Still processing," I said. 9 window. "Send me confirmation screenshots. Every detail." "We move now." I forwarded everything, transaction logs, authentication timestamps, the prenup clause excerpt, the LLC registry documents. "Within minutes," he called back. "We're filing an emergency motion for temporary financial restraining order," he said. "On grounds of credible asset concealment and potential unauthorized credential usage." "Will that stop it?" I asked. "If we can get the bank's fraud department to flag it before final settlement." "Yes." "Before final settlement." He asked for the bank's fraud hotline number. I provided it. He instructed me to remain available for verification calls. At 7:15, my phone rang. "This is Corporate Fraud Prevention." The woman on the line said, "We've received legal notification of potential irregularities involving your joint account. We need to verify recent international wire activity." "I'm available," I said. She asked standard questions first, identity confirmation. Recent transactions? Whether I had personally authorized transfers to Malta? "No," I said clearly. "I did not." There was a pause. "Were your login credentials accessible to anyone else in your household?" "My husband had physical access to my device," I said. "But I did not authorize those transfers." Another pause. Slightly longer. "We're reviewing authentication logs. There appear to be approvals originating from a recognized device tied to your profile. I was in surgery during one of those approvals." I said. Silence. "Thank you for that information," she said carefully. "We are placing a temporary hold pending review." Temporary hold. At 7:58, I refreshed the portal again. The status had changed. Under review. My shoulders dropped slightly, but not fully. Jonathan emerged from the bedroom at 8:15, hair still damp from the shower. He glanced at me, then at the clock. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." He poured coffee and checked his phone. I watched the moment his expression shifted. "What's going on with the bank?" he asked. Too casually. "What do you mean?" "I got a notification about a transfer delay." I held his gaze. "Which transfer?" He hesitated. "The investment one," he said. "It's just a diversification move. Probably a routine check." "Routine?" I asked. He nodded. "International wires sometimes get flagged." His phone buzzed again. He stepped into the hallway to answer. "I don't know why it's under review," he said in a tight whisper. No. She doesn't know anything. It's probably compliance noise. Probably compliance noise. I refreshed the portal again. The pending wire now displayed a red banner. Suspended, pending investigation. My phone rang. Daniel. They've paused it, he said. And we've filed the emergency motion. If the judge signs the temporary injunction, any further attempt to move funds could constitute contempt. Will he be notified? I asked. He'll find out soon enough. At 9:23, my phone buzzed with another alert from the bank. Unusual authentication pattern detected. They were reviewing prior authorizations. Jonathan came back into the kitchen, his expression tighter now. Did you log into the bank? He asked. Yes. Why? Because I received a confirmation email about international transfers. His eyes flickered. What email? The one that mentioned Malta. He froze. That wasn't meant. He stopped himself. It was just an investment. Why was my email removed from alerts 8 weeks ago? He blinked. It was cluttering your inbox. And why were transfers authorized from my device while I was in surgery? Silence fell between us. His jaw tightened. You're overreacting. Am I? My phone buzzed again. Fraud prevention. Please verify recent login activity. Jonathan saw the notification preview. What did you do? He asked. His voice lower now. I read the confirmation, I said evenly. He stared at me as if trying to calculate how much I knew. It's temporary, he said finally. The funds are safe. For whom? I asked. He didn't answer. At 10:15, Daniel called again. The judge has been notified of the urgency, he said. We expect a temporary order within 48 hours. In the meantime, the bank has agreed to maintain suspension. I looked at Jonathan, who was now pacing near the window. There's more. Daniel added. We flagged potential credential misuse. That changes their internal risk assessment. When I hung up, Jonathan's phone rang again. I saw the name flash briefly before he turned it away. Stephanie. He stepped outside to take the call. I could hear her voice through the door. Sharper now. What do you mean frozen? She demanded faintly. It's just a review, he said. Don't panic. Don't panic. I opened the secondary savings account details again. The balance remained intact. The large pending transfer had not cleared. But as I refreshed the dashboard one more time, something new appeared. A separate outgoing request had been initiated from another account, one not labeled joint. Different account number. Different routing path. They were adapting. I closed the laptop slowly. He thought he could outrun the system by changing routes. He didn't understand that once the system begins watching, every path lights up. Jonathan came back inside, his face pale. What did you do? He asked again. I looked at him calmly. I read the email. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Outside, the morning moved on as if nothing had shifted. Inside, the plan he believed was clean had just been marked for review. Jonathan came home before noon. He never came home before noon on a weekday. The front door closed harder than usual, and I heard his keys hit the console table with a metallic clatter. His footsteps moved quickly down the hallway toward the kitchen, then stopped when he saw me sitting at the island. My laptop closed, a cup of coffee untouched in front of me. You talked to the bank, he said. It wasn't a question. I read the confirmation email, I replied. His jaw tightened. That wasn't meant for you. That's not how shared accounts work. He ran a hand through his hair and began pacing. It's an investment. That's all it is. International diversification. We've talked about expanding before. Have we? I asked calmly. He stopped pacing. You know, I handle most of the financial logistics. I didn't want to overwhelm you while you were recovering. I was in surgery when one of those transfers was authorized from my device, I said. He went still. What are you implying? He asked. I'm stating a timestamp. For a split second, something crossed his face, not anger, not defensiveness, fear. You're making this bigger than it is, he said. The bank flags things all the time. They've placed the transfer under review, I said. His head snapped up. What? The large one. It's suspended. He stared at me as if recalculating everything. That's temporary, he said quickly. It's just compliance noise. Is the investor visa temporary too? The words hung in the air between us. His expression shifted. Subtle but unmistakable. What visa? He asked. The one tied to Atlas Holdings. Malta residency by investment. Filed under the status separated. He blinked. You've been digging, he said quietly. I've been reading. His phone buzzed on the counter. He flipped it over without looking. But I caught the name before the screen went dark. Stephanie. He grabbed the phone and stepped outside to answer. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. His voice carried through the sliding glass door. It's just a review, he said urgently. No. The funds haven't cleared yet. I told you not to panic. A sharper voice responded. Too faint to make out the words, but loud enough to hear the edge. I'm handling it, he insisted. Don't call the consultant yet. Consultant. I stood and walked to the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. Is she nervous? I asked when he came back inside. His eyes flashed. This isn't about her. It seems like it is. He exhaled sharply. You're spiraling. No, I said softly. I'm stabilizing. He looked at me as if I were someone he didn't recognize. You don't understand how these structures work, he said. Global capital doesn't just sit in one jurisdiction anymore. I design systems for a living, I replied. I understand flow. He opened his mouth, then closed it. You spoke to a lawyer, he said suddenly. Yes. That word seemed to land harder than anything else. For what? He demanded. For clarity. You're going to file, he asked. Not yet. His shoulders dropped slightly. But not fully. Then why escalate this? He pressed. We could have handled this privately. You used my credentials, I said. Silence. That's not escalation. I continued. That's documentation. His phone buzzed again. This time he ignored it. I was protecting us, he said finally. You don't know what's coming in the market. I was creating options. For whom? For both of us, he snapped. Does Stephanie think so? His face hardened. This has nothing to do with her. She's pregnant. His eyes flickered again. That's complicated, he said. So is structuring transfers under reporting thresholds, I replied. He stared at me, searching for something. Panic. Maybe. Or hysteria. He found neither. You're overreacting, he said again. But the words lacked conviction. My phone buzzed. Daniel. I answered on speaker without breaking eye contact with Jonathan. The bank has escalated to formal fraud review, Daniel said evenly. We've also confirmed that an investor residency application was submitted 2 weeks ago using LLC funds. Jonathan's face drained of color. If the court signs the temporary injunction, Daniel continued, all associated entities, including the LLC and related trust accounts, will fall under restriction. Jonathan stepped closer. Take me off speaker, he said sharply. I muted the call. You had no right, he said, his voice low and tight. No right to what? I asked. To interfere. With money that legally belongs to both of us. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. Daniel's voice came faintly through the muted line. I unmuted. There's more, he said. Compliance has requested identity verification from Jonathan directly. They've flagged unusual authentication tied to Megan's profile. Jonathan's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. That's absurd, he said loudly. Daniel didn't respond to him. If the credential misuse element is substantiated, exposure broadens beyond family court. Beyond family court. I ended the call. Jonathan stood there, staring at me. You've turned this into something it didn't need to be, he said. No, I replied calmly. You did that when you assumed I wouldn't look. He ran both hands through his hair again, pacing now. Faster. They'll release it. he said. Once this clears, everything settles. If you attempt another transfer while under review, I said, it won't just be compliance noise. He stopped pacing. What are you threatening? He asked. I'm not threatening anything, I said. I'm describing systems. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then his phone buzzed again. This time, he answered in front of me. It's under review, he said into the receiver. Yes, I know what that means. His eyes never left mine. No, she's not filing yet, he said. I'll handle it. He ended the call and exhaled slowly. Don't do this, he said. I didn't, I replied. Outside. The sky had darkened slightly, clouds rolling in from the west. My phone buzzed one more time. Court review scheduled within 48 hours. Temporary financial injunction pending judicial signature. Jonathan didn't know that yet. He believed this was a negotiation. He hadn't realized it was becoming a record. The court order arrived at 3:17 in the afternoon. I was sitting at my desk when the email notification appeared. Subject line stark and unemotional. Temporary financial restraining order, granted. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Then I opened the attachment. The language was clinical. Precise? Effective immediately. Neither party was permitted to transfer, conceal, or dissipate marital assets pending further hearing. All associated entities tied to identified accounts were subject to review. Associated entities: Atlas Holdings, LLC, the Nevada Trust, any linked foreign beneficiary accounts. My phone buzzed seconds later. Jonathan. I let it ring once before answering. What did you do? He demanded. I didn't do anything, I said evenly. A judge did. There was silence on the other end. Then a sharp exhale. You filed, he said. I requested protection. You blindsided me. You removed me from account alerts. He didn't respond. I just got a notification, he said finally. The LLC is frozen. The trust is flagged. Do you have any idea what that means? Yes, I said. It means the system noticed. You've humiliated me, he snapped. This isn't about humiliation, he laughed. But there was no humor in it. You think this makes you powerful? No, I replied. It makes the money stationary. He hung up. Within minutes, my phone lit up again. Stephanie. I hesitated. Then answered. Her voice was tighter than I'd ever heard it. What did you file? I protected marital assets. You froze everything, she said. Do you understand the damage that causes? To whom? There was a pause. We had plans, she said. I'm aware. You're being vindictive. No, I said calmly. I'm being procedural. Her breath quickened slightly. The consultant said once the capital requirement is delayed. The residency track resets. Residency track. For Malta, I asked. Silence. You've destroyed months of preparation, she continued. Do you know what it took to set that up? Yes, I said. Structured transfers. Threshold avoidance. A Delaware funnel. She went quiet. You've been digging, she said. I read the email. The line went dead. I leaned back in my chair and let the quiet settle. An hour later, Jonathan's mother called. Megan, she said, her voice softer than usual. This is escalating unnecessarily. I followed legal advice. You could have spoken to us first, she insisted. Families handle things internally. Families don't hide transfers. Her tone sharpened. Jonathan was securing the future. For whom? For everyone, she said quickly. I didn't answer. You've put us in a very difficult position, she continued. The LLC is tied to multiple stakeholders. Which stakeholders? I asked. Silence. This doesn't have to become adversarial, she said carefully. It already was. She ended the call without saying goodbye. By evening, Jonathan was home again. Earlier than usual, he stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, watching me as if I were an unfamiliar variable. You've turned compliance into warfare, he said. I didn't choose the battlefield. You involved the court. You involved Malta. His eyes flashed. It was an investment. It was an exit. He didn't deny it this time. We weren't going to leave you with nothing, he said finally. The phrasing caught my attention. Leave. You already planned the separation, I said. He looked away. It wasn't finalized, he muttered. But it was structured. He exhaled sharply and paced toward the window. You don't understand the pressure I've been under, he said. Stephanie is pregnant, I finished. His shoulders dropped slightly. You weren't supposed to find out like this, he said. How was I supposed to find out? Silence filled the space between us again. He rubbed his temples. The injunction complicates everything. That was the point. If the court expands review into credential misuse, he said carefully, this could go beyond divorce proceedings. Then perhaps you should explain why my device authorized transfers while I was under anesthesia. His face went pale. He stopped himself. What? I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his phone and stepped into the hallway again. His voice carried faintly. We need to talk to him, he said. If this turns into a fraud inquiry, it's bigger than family court. Him. Consultant. Lawyer. Someone else. I opened my laptop again and checked the bank dashboard. All flagged transfers now displayed a new status. Legal hold. The Nevada Trust showed restricted Atlas Holdings. Compliance investigation active. Every pathway they had built was illuminated. My email pinged again. From Daniel. Be prepared. If they attempt to reclassify funds or claim sole ownership, we counter immediately. Sole ownership. Jonathan returned. His expression hard. This isn't over, he said. I know. You think freezing accounts means you win. I don't think in terms of winning, I replied. I think in terms of records. He stared at me for a long moment. You've changed, he said quietly. No, I said. I stopped pretending. Outside, the rain began lightly against the windows. The house felt smaller now, tighter, as if the walls were listening too. Jonathan's phone buzzed again. He didn't answer this time. I looked at him across the kitchen island. This man who had believed distance and structure would shield him. The injunction hadn't ended anything. It had simply shifted the arena. And I had the distinct feeling that what they feared most wasn't the freeze. It was what might surface next. The letter arrived by certified mail 2 days later. Jonathan signed for it at the door, glanced at the sender, and went still. For a second, I saw something close to panic flicker across his face before he masked it. What is it? I asked from the living room. Nothing, he said too quickly. Just legal paperwork. He walked toward his office instead of opening it at the kitchen counter like he normally would. I heard the door close. Then the faint sound of paper being unfolded. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Daniel. They've responded, he said without preamble. Jonathan's counsel just filed a motion claiming certain funds were separate property tied to premarital assets. I almost laughed. Premarital, I repeated. Yes. They're attempting to reclassify the transfers as originating from his personal inheritance. Inheritance. Jonathan's father had passed 5 years ago. The estate had been modest. Nothing close to the sums wired to Malta. That's false, I said calmly. I know, Daniel replied. But they've attached documentation. What documentation? Statements from a private account opened shortly before the first Malta transfer. The account is in his name only. I closed my eyes briefly. They moved it, I said. Explain. They must have funneled funds from our joint account into a personal account first, then transferred internationally from there. That's what it looks like, Daniel confirmed. They're arguing the LLC was capitalized with his separate property. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear. Recognition. Jonathan stepped out of his office at that moment. His face controlled again. You've escalated, he said. You responded? I replied. He held up the letter. My attorney says the injunction was excessive. The funds you froze were not marital. Then why was my profile used to authorize them? He didn't answer. They were inheritance. He insisted. My father intended that money for me. Your father's estate closed years ago, I said quietly. You don't know the full structure, he snapped. Then explain it. Silence. His phone buzzed. Stephanie. He declined it this time. I stood and walked toward him slowly. You're trying to reclassify joint funds after the fact. That's not true. Then show me the inheritance trail. His jaw tightened. Lawyers will handle that, he said. Of course. My phone buzzed again. Daniel, there's something else, he said when I answered. The fraud review has expanded. The bank's internal audit detected device cloning. I went very still. Cloning? I asked. Yes. It appears that a backup of your authentication credentials was created 8 weeks ago. 8 weeks. The week of my surgery. They're investigating whether that violates federal statutes. Daniel continued. If substantiated, this leaves the realm of civil dispute. Jonathan watched my face carefully. They're reviewing metadata from your laptop. Daniel added. If you didn't initiate that clone, it's significant. I said. Jonathan's expression shifted slightly. What are they saying? He demanded when I ended the call. They're reviewing authentication duplication. I replied evenly. His face drained of color. That's ridiculous, he said. No one duplicated anything. The audit says otherwise. He ran a hand through his hair again. Pacing now. Faster than before. This is spiraling out of control, he muttered. You started it. No, he snapped. You did when you involved compliance. I read the email, I said again. He stopped pacing and looked at me. Something close to desperation now in his eyes. You don't understand how this looks, he said. If this becomes criminal, then perhaps you shouldn't have cloned my credentials. I didn't. He cut himself off again. The silence between us felt electric. At that moment, his phone rang again. This time he answered immediately. What? He demanded. I could hear Stephanie's voice clearly through the speaker now, sharp and furious. They're calling it misrepresentation, she said. The consultant says if there's even a hint of fraud, the residency application is void. It's not fraud, Jonathan insisted. They're asking about source of funds documentation, she continued. They want proof the capital wasn't marital. Proof. Jonathan glanced at me. I told you not to panic, he said. I am not panicking, she snapped. I'm protecting my child. The words hung in the air. My child. He stepped into the hallway to continue the call. I remained in the kitchen, listening to the rain begin again outside. When he returned, his face was pale. They're overreacting, he said. Who is they? I asked. The consultant? Immigration advisors. Immigration. It's complicated, he added. Yes, I said. It is. He looked at me as if weighing something. We can settle this quietly, he said finally. Withdraw the injunction. Let the transfers go through. We can divide what remains. And pretend the cloning didn't happen. He flinched. You're assuming intent, he said. I'm reading logs. He exhaled sharply and leaned against the counter. You're going to destroy everything, he muttered. I didn't build it. My phone buzzed again. Daniel, they've scheduled a hearing, he said. And the fraud unit has requested an interview. Interview? I asked. Yes. With both of you? Jonathan stared at me. This is insane, he whispered. No, I said softly. This is documentation catching up. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Jonathan's carefully constructed exit plan, LLC, trust, residency track was unraveling not because I shouted, not because I cried, because the system had been asked to look. He had believed structure would protect him. He hadn't accounted for audit trails. And now, it wasn't just money under review. It was intention. The fraud unit scheduled the interviews for the following Tuesday morning. Jonathan didn't speak much that weekend. He moved through the house like someone measuring exits, checking his phone constantly. Stepping outside for calls, he no longer bothered to hide. I stayed in my office, gathering documentation, organizing timestamps, aligning statements with metadata. When systems fracture, clarity becomes your only leverage. Tuesday arrived gray and cold. We drove to the bank's regional compliance office in separate cars. He walked in ahead of me, shoulders tight, jaw set. The receptionist directed us to a conference room with glass walls and a long oak table. 2 people were already seated inside, a compliance officer and a forensic audit specialist. They introduced themselves politely, almost gently. "This is a routine investigation," the compliance officer said. "We're reviewing authentication irregularities and source of funds declarations." Jonathan nodded stiffly. "Of course." The forensic specialist opened a laptop and turned the screen slightly toward us. "We detected a credential backup event 8 weeks ago," she said. "It occurred on a secondary device. The backup included authentication tokens tied to Mrs. Hale's profile. My profile. I did not authorize any duplication," I said calmly. Jonathan shifted in his seat. "We share devices in the household," he said. "It could have been a sync event." The specialist shook her head gently. This was not a passive sync. It required active credential export. Silence. She clicked to another screen. "We also noted structured transfers originating shortly after that duplication event," she continued. "Funds moved from the joint account to a personal account in Mr. Hale's name, then internationally to an entity associated with Atlas Holdings LLC. Jonathan's breathing grew shallow. "The LLC is mine," he said quickly. "It was capitalized with inheritance funds. Documentation provided for that claim is under review." The compliance officer replied, "Preliminary analysis suggests commingling prior to reclassification." Commingling? Jonathan's hand tightened around the armrest. "This feels accusatory," he said. "It's procedural," the officer corrected calmly. They turned to me. "Mrs. Hala, did you consent in writing to the international transfers?" she asked. "No." "Were you aware of the Malta beneficiary?" "No." They nodded and typed. Then they turned back to Jonathan. "Did you at any point access Mrs. Hale's device while she was incapacitated?" He hesitated. "I had access to our home office," he said carefully. "That was not the question." The forensic specialist replied, "The room felt smaller suddenly. I may have logged into the account to streamline approvals," he said finally. "It wasn't malicious. Were you aware that exporting authentication credentials without explicit consent can constitute unauthorized access?" she asked. His silence stretched too long. The compliance officer closed the laptop. "We're escalating this review," she said. "Depending on findings. This may be referred beyond internal audit." Jonathan stood abruptly. "This is absurd," he said. "It was my money. Joint account." The officer corrected. We left the building in silence. Outside, the air felt sharp and metallic. He turned to me in the parking lot. "You've ruined everything," he said. "I didn't clone anything," I replied. "You didn't have to involve the bank. You involved Malta." His face hardened. "You think this makes you righteous?" "No," I said. "It makes records visible." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing a few steps away before turning back. "If this goes criminal," he said, "it drags everyone down." "Everyone?" I asked. His eyes flickered. "Stephanie. Atlas Holdings. His mother. Mark." Later that afternoon, Daniel called. "They're serious," he said. "If the credential export is confirmed intentional, that's potential federal exposure." I closed my eyes briefly. "And the residency application?" I asked. "Voided," he said. "Malta's compliance flagged the funds under review, without clear source of funds validation. It's dead." Dead. Jonathan called me an hour later from somewhere outside the house. "She's blaming me," he said. For what? For promising stability. Silence. She said I guaranteed the capital was clean. He continued. Was it? I asked. He didn't answer. I never meant for it to get this far, he said quietly. But it did. That night, he didn't come home. I sat at the kitchen table alone. The house unusually quiet. My laptop screen glowed softly, displaying updated account statuses. Legal hold active. Compliance investigation expanded. LLC restricted. Nevada Trust under review. Everything they had built as an escape route now existed as a paper trail. My phone buzzed once more. Daniel. There's something else, he said. Jonathan's attorney reached out. They're proposing settlement. Already. They're worried about exposure. They want to negotiate asset division before findings finalize. Fear moves faster than strategy. What are they offering? I asked. Significant concession, he said. They're willing to concede primary residence and majority liquid assets in exchange for limiting further inquiry. Limit further inquiry. I stared at the glowing screen. Jonathan had believed he was orchestrating a clean departure. Now he was negotiating containment. Outside, the rain returned softly against the windows. My phone buzzed again. Jonathan, I can fix this, he said when I answered. How? Withdraw the fraud allegation. We'll settle quietly. It's not an allegation, I replied. It's an audit. He exhaled sharply. I was trying to protect my future, he said. You endangered mine. The silence stretched. Then, quietly, he said, if they refer this, it won't just be divorce anymore. I looked at the transaction log one more time. At the duplicated credential timestamp. At the structured transfers. He had thought secrecy was power. He hadn't realized documentation was stronger. I didn't escalate, I said softly. I just refused to ignore the record. Jonathan didn't come home that night. He texted once, shortly after 11. Staying with Mark. Need space. I didn't respond. The house felt different without him, quieter, but not empty. More like a system that had shed a corrupted file and was recalibrating. The next morning, Daniel called before 8. They've escalated, he said. The bank has formally referred the credential duplication to a federal review unit. My coffee cooled untouched in my hand. Criminal? I asked. Potentially, he said. It depends on intent and scale. But the referral itself changes leverage. Leverage. I closed my eyes briefly. And settlement? I asked. They're pushing harder, he replied. Jonathan's attorney wants a meeting today. They're prepared to concede substantial assets if you agree not to pursue further claims tied to credential misuse. Not pursue further claims. They want containment. I said. Yes. I agreed to the meeting. We gathered in Daniel's office at 2 in the afternoon. Jonathan sat across from me at the long conference table, his attorney beside him, a folder thick with paper in front of them. He looked exhausted. His attorney spoke first. We believe this situation has escalated unnecessarily, she began. However, my client is prepared to make significant concessions to resolve matters swiftly. What kind of concessions? Daniel asked calmly. The marital residence will be transferred entirely to Mrs. Hala, she said. In addition, 65% of liquid joint assets. 65. A number chosen to sound generous. And the LLC? Daniel asked. It will be dissolved, she said. Funds returned where appropriate. Where appropriate, Daniel repeated. Jonathan finally spoke. I never intended for this to become federal, he said quietly. You exported my credentials, I replied. I streamlined access, he said quickly. It wasn't malicious. The word malicious hovered between us. Daniel leaned forward. Intent is not determined by tone, he said evenly. It's determined by action. Jonathan's attorney cleared her throat. My client is willing to sign a sworn affidavit acknowledging improper access, she said, in exchange for mutual agreement not to pursue criminal referral. My pulse slowed. You don't control referral, Daniel said. The bank does. Silence. Jonathan looked at me. Please, he said quietly. We can end this. End this. Did you tell her the truth? I asked. He hesitated. About what? About the inheritance trail, I said. His attorney stiffened slightly. That's irrelevant to settlement, she said quickly. It's relevant to truth, I replied. Jonathan looked away. The funds were partially joint, he admitted quietly. Partially. Daniel made a note. And the residency application? I asked. He exhaled slowly. It's void. Stephanie's future, built on structured transfers and paperwork, had collapsed. And the trust? I asked. Under review, his attorney said. The room felt tight, heavy with unfinished admissions. Daniel turned to me. The referral proceeds regardless, he said softly. You cannot withdraw what you did not initiate. I nodded. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. I thought I could fix it, he said. I thought moving the money first would simplify everything. For you, I said. He didn't deny it. I never meant to leave you with nothing, he added. You already did, I replied quietly. Not financially. Emotionally. Silence settled over the table. His attorney slid the settlement proposal across to Daniel. We recommend swift resolution, she said. Further exposure benefits no one. Exposure. It had been the word echoing through every stage of this unraveling. Daniel scanned the pages carefully. Asset division is acceptable in principle, he said. But dissolution of the LLC must include full accounting. No sealed records. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Full accounting, Daniel repeated. My phone buzzed in my bag. I glanced at it briefly. Unknown number. I ignored it. Jonathan leaned forward. If this referral continues, he said, it could affect employment. You should have considered that before cloning my credentials, I replied. He winced slightly. I was desperate, he said. For what? I asked. For control. The honesty surprised me. Outside the window, the sky had cleared slightly. Thin sunlight cutting through lingering clouds. Daniel finished reviewing the document. We'll counter with 75% liquid assets, full property transfer, and written acknowledgement of unauthorized access, he said. Non-negotiable. Jonathan's attorney hesitated. That's steep, she said. So is federal exposure, Daniel replied calmly. Jonathan stared at the table for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Fine, he said. It wasn't anger in his voice. It was resignation. The meeting ended with no handshakes. As we stepped into the hallway, Jonathan paused beside me. I never thought you'd go this far, he said quietly. I never thought you would either, I replied. He studied my face as if searching for something, vindication, triumph. He found neither. This isn't revenge, he said. No, I answered. It's consequence. Outside. The air felt lighter. My phone buzzed again. The same unknown number. This time, I answered. A male voice introduced himself as a Federal Review liaison, confirming receipt of the bank's referral and requesting documentation timelines. Jonathan watched my expression shift. It's proceeding, I said simply. His shoulders sagged. I ended the call and looked at him one last time. You thought distance would protect you. You thought structure would hide you. You thought I wouldn't look. The settlement wasn't the end. It was a recalibration. And the system was still running. The final hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early October. By then, the leaves in Portland had started to turn. Copper and gold lining the sidewalks outside the courthouse. I arrived early. Alone. Jonathan walked in 15 minutes later with his attorney. His posture straighter than it had been in weeks. As if rehearsing composure. Inside the courtroom, everything felt smaller than the chaos that had led us there. The judge reviewed the settlement terms first. Property transfer. 75% of liquid joint assets. Dissolution of Atlas Holdings LLC with mandatory forensic accounting. Written acknowledgement of unauthorized credential access. Jonathan's attorney framed it as a mutually agreed restructuring. Daniel didn't correct her. The judge looked over his glasses at Jonathan. "Mr. Hala," he said evenly, "do you acknowledge accessing your spouse's authentication credentials without explicit consent?" Jonathan swallowed. "Yes." "Do you acknowledge that certain transfers originated from jointly held funds?" "Yes." The word landed heavily in the room. There was no dramatic confession. No raised voices. Just quiet admissions pressed into official record. The judge signed the property transfer order without hesitation. The temporary financial restraining order will remain in effect until all accounting is complete, he added. Any deviation will result in immediate sanctions. Jonathan nodded. When the hearing ended, I stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air and let it fill my lungs slowly. He followed me out. "It's done," he said. "It's documented," I replied. There was a difference. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I never wanted this to explode," he said quietly. "You structured it to avoid visibility." I answered. "Explosions happen when pressure builds." He looked tired now. Less defensive. More hollow. "They're still reviewing," he said. "I know." The federal referral had not vanished with the settlement. It was still moving through its own process. Separate from divorce court. Stephanie had stopped calling weeks ago. Her social media accounts were gone. Malta was no longer mentioned anywhere. "I lost the residency track," he said suddenly. "I'm aware." They flagged the source of funds declaration. "Yes." He exhaled sharply. "Mark is furious," he added. "The LLC dissolution affects him too." "He participated," I said calmly. Jonathan looked at me, almost searching for cruelty in my expression. "You don't look satisfied," he said. "I'm not." He frowned. "I'm not celebrating," I clarified. "I'm stabilizing." We stood in silence as traffic moved past the courthouse steps. "Will you push the referral?" he asked carefully. "I didn't start it," I said. "The bank did." He nodded slowly. "I thought if I moved fast enough, I could control the outcome," he admitted. "Control is an illusion," I said. "Audit trails are not." He almost smiled at that. But it faded quickly. "I underestimated you," he said. "You underestimated systems," I corrected. He hesitated, then spoke more quietly. "I was scared," he said. "About the baby. About starting over. I thought securing money first would simplify everything." "For you," I repeated. He didn't argue this time. "You'll be fine," he said after a moment. "You always are." I looked at him steadily. "I wasn't fine in that hospital bed," I said. "You just assumed I wouldn't wake up in time." His jaw tightened. But he didn't deny it. We parted without another word. Over the next few weeks, paperwork moved methodically. The house deed transferred solely into my name. The joint accounts were divided under court supervision. The forensic accounting of Atlas Holdings revealed exactly what I had suspected: layered transfers, temporary reclassification attempts, coordination with the Nevada Trust. Nothing theatrical. Just confirmation. The federal review eventually resulted in a negotiated compliance penalty rather than prosecution. Jonathan's employer was notified. His position was reduced. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. One evening in late November, I sat alone at the kitchen table, now legally mine, and watched rain streak the windows. The house felt different. Not empty. Claimed. I opened my laptop and logged into the bank portal one more time. Almost out of habit. All holds were lifted. All accounts stable. No red banners. No pending wires. Just clean balances and clean ownership. My phone buzzed softly. A message from Jonathan. "I'm sorry." 2 words. No explanations. No defense. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I typed back, "Take care of your child." I didn't add anything else. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. The city lights reflected faintly against the glass. The world outside continued as it always had, indifferent to divorce, to betrayal, to structured transfers and failed residencies. People think revenge is loud. They imagine slammed doors, shouted accusations, dramatic victories. But sometimes revenge is quieter. Sometimes it's a judge's signature, a frozen account, a documented admission. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let someone rewrite the record. I didn't destroy Jonathan's plan. I illuminated it. And once light enters a system, concealment collapses on its own. The rain continued steadily outside. Inside, for the first time in months, there was no pending notification waiting to disrupt the quiet. I didn't move out. That surprised everyone more than the settlement numbers did. People assumed I would sell the house, start over somewhere else, erase every trace of what had happened inside those walls. But I had no interest in running from a place simply because someone else had tried to rewrite my future there. The house was mine now, legally, structurally, undeniably. The first weekend after everything finalized, I walked through each room slowly. The hallway where Jonathan used to pace during late-night calls, the kitchen island where he had asked, "What did you do?" As if truth were sabotage. The office where I had watched transaction logs refresh in real time, red banners appearing like warning lights on a dashboard. Nothing in the house had betrayed me. A person had... That distinction mattered. I repainted the bedroom first. Soft gray. Clean lines. No shared photos returned to the walls. I boxed up the framed vacations, the anniversary gifts, the illusions of permanence. I didn't burn them. I didn't destroy them. I archived them. Closure isn't dramatic. It's administrative. 2 weeks later, the final accounting report from Atlas Holdings arrived in my inbox. Daniel forwarded it with a short note. As expected. The report was dense: charts, timestamps, reclassification attempts, internal transfers layered to appear legitimate. It confirmed that more than 70% of the funds originally routed through the LLC had originated from our joint account before being cycled through Jonathan's personal account. Inheritance had been a narrative. The numbers told a different story. I closed the document and felt something unexpected. Not anger. Relief. The truth had weight. But it also had gravity. It anchored things in place. Jonathan's compliance penalty had been finalized quietly. No arrest. No headline. A negotiated resolution. His role at work reduced. His internal review record permanent. Consequence doesn't always look cinematic. Sometimes it looks like a demotion email and a file marked restricted. Stephanie never contacted me again. I heard through mutual acquaintances that the residency application had been permanently voided, without clean source of funds documentation. Malta wasn't interested. The consultant withdrew. The soon in her filtered sunset post became nothing more than a caption trapped in digital memory. I wondered sometimes whether she had believed him, whether she had thought the money was clean, whether she had assumed I was naive. It didn't matter anymore. One evening, I sat at the same kitchen island where the first confrontation had taken place and opened my laptop, not to check transactions this time, but to return to work. A client dashboard loaded. Wireframes. User flows. Authentication logic. Systems designed to protect access. I smiled faintly at the irony. When I had heard Jonathan in that hospital hallway, whispering about how the money's already moved, I had felt something collapse inside me. Not love. Trust. Trust is an invisible infrastructure. You don't notice it until someone tries to reroute it. He had believed speed would protect him. That moving assets quickly, quietly, internationally would give him control over the narrative of our divorce. He thought I would be too distracted, too emotional, too physically exhausted to look at the details. He underestimated two things: systems, and me. I didn't win because I yelled louder. I didn't win because I hurt him more. I won because I read the email, because I understood how data leaves trails, because I refused to ignore what didn't align. People like to romanticize revenge. They want fireworks, dramatic speeches, A moment where the villain realizes everything at once. But real revenge, the kind that restores dignity, rarely looks like that. It looks like documentation. It looks like a judge's signature. It looks like sitting in a quiet kitchen months later, knowing no one can quietly siphon your future away. Jonathan called once. Around Christmas. I'm moving to a smaller place, he said. Closer to work. I hope it's peaceful, I replied. There was a long pause. You're different now, he said. I'm clearer, I corrected. After we hung up, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt stable. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and rain tapping against the windows again, Portland's constant soundtrack. I walked to the window and looked at my reflection in the glass. I didn't see a victim. I didn't see a villain. I saw someone who had almost been excluded from her own financial life, almost rewritten out of her own marriage story, almost erased through structured transfers and quiet paperwork. Almost. All because of one email sent to the wrong address. If that message had never reached me, the wires would have cleared. The residency track would have locked in. The trust would have matured quietly offshore. And I would have been left trying to prove absence instead of documenting action. Instead, the record exists. That's the difference between loss and leverage. If you're listening to this and something in your life feels off, an unexplained change, a missing notification, a pattern that doesn't quite align, don't ignore it. Don't assume you're overthinking. Sometimes clarity starts with one small detail you refuse to delete. If this story resonated with you, stay with me. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever uncovered a hidden truth through something small? Do you believe revenge is about punishment? Or about protection? Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives in an email-marked confirmation. And sometimes, that's all it takes. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.